My name is Stefanía, and as was well just said, I'm from the Thriving Ocean Research Hub, which is based here in Geosciences. I'm doing a PhD. I'm nearing the end of my first year now, so today I'm going to be telling you a bit about my current PhD plans, talking you through some background, my current project aims, and the research design. I'm supervised by John Connell, here from the department, and also by Adrian Lindegaard, who's based at Oxford. So my project broadly looks at how access, and I'll explain to you what exactly I mean when I use the word access, because it gets used in various different ways, but how it can act as a driver of social ecological processes and with a focus on coral reef small-scale fisheries. I want to start as well by recognizing and paying respect to elders and communities past, present, and emerging on the land we are here today. And then to set the stage, now the ongoing expansion and intensification of human activities globally, whether you're looking at terrestrial systems, marine systems, just showing some examples here, is altering the availability and distribution of natural resources globally. And this in turn is increasing competition over access to those resources and access to benefiting from them. Management responses to this challenge, whether thinking about in policy, in the literature, NGO responses have remained primarily focused on rights. So who has legally recognized claims to own, control, or manage a resource, or simply put, their right to benefit. And this approach is really important, and it's really important to think about rights, but it only captures a part of the picture of how resource access actually operates in practice. This was argued by Reef and Peluso in their paper, A Theory of Access, where they drew attention to all these other mechanisms, social relation mechanisms, that can interact with rights to shape who actually is able to benefit in practice. So in doing so, in highlighting these mechanisms, they moved away from a definition or sort of view of access as simply the right to benefit to actually the ability to derive benefits. So I just want to provide some examples of how these mechanisms can play a role for fisheries. So firstly, thinking about technology. So yeah, you might have a fishing license, but to actually catch some fish, you might need access to a boat. You might need traps or nets, as shown here. And if you're getting, more of the more expensive fishing boats to go further out, like a motorized boat, you're going to need some capital to purchase that boat. Markets can also play a really big role in shaping what kind of benefits you can derive from fish, as they allow a fisher to turn a fish, which could be used for subsistence or gifting, into an actual commodity, which they can trade and could get an income from. Social identity is another mechanism that often plays a key role in fisheries in shaping what kind of access to fishing and the benefits you can derive. So I'm showing here two pictures of different kinds of small-scale fishing. On the right, you have women out gleaning. So this is a shore-based activity where you go out from the beach and to catch things like octopus or sea urchin. Whereas here on the left, you see a fishing boat out on the water with a net, catching fish in a much bigger net. And this is just to draw attention that in some communities, it's not considered appropriate for women, for instance, to go out on the fishing boats, so they're restricted to gleaning and other nearshore fishing-based activities. And just the last one to explain is social relations. So this is essentially who do you know? So it's just to draw attention to, you may not yourself have, the fishing boat or the gig, but you may know someone, you may have a friend or, in your kinship network, people that allow you to borrow their gear or learn about new fishing grounds, learn about the use of new technologies. So all these things can also help you get access to fishing. So just to sort of bring it all together, this is all just to highlight that a rights-based approach when looking at access might emphasize whether you have legally recognized rights, like some kind of a license for fishing, but in reality, all these other mechanisms, and just to flag that I didn't go through all of them just because it would take a while, but they can all play a role in shaping access. And so they can play a role in shaping who actually benefits in practice. And so these kind of sort of mismatches you can get between formally recognized rights, so say, they think a certain group has fishing access and then realized access, can reinforce existing inequalities and lead to further marginalization of vulnerable groups. So it's really important that natural resource management approaches start bringing more attention to these other mechanisms that can interact with rights as part of their decision-making processes. Okay, So yeah, we're thinking about this kind of dynamic here. So you have some kind of natural resource which you can use and benefit from. Right space approaches have focus on rights and also sometimes consider power. So this can be broadly defined as the capacity or ability to direct, influence, or control the behaviors of others, some kind of events or resources. And then theory of access drew attention to with some mechanisms we've just been through, and again considers the role of power. And the theory of access has been applied across diverse socioeconomic contexts and natural resource management systems to think about how actors are able to obtain and control access to a resource. But what hasn't really been done is thought about how this kind of access dynamics sits within the broader socio-ecological system. To consider how that resource access can feedback and shape the availability of the resource, and through that can shape future access. So I'm using the term socio-ecological system thinking here to sort of broadly refer to a way of thinking that draws attention to these links and feedbacks between human and environmental systems. I'm just going to break it down a bit more. So we start out by putting on our access hat, so with viewing this through an access lens. So you get an increased access to market, which leads to an increased price for fish. In theory, this could lead to some kind of increased financial well-being at a community level for some individuals. And from an access perspective, you might look at this and go in and try to understand who is able to derive benefits from this increased access to markets. And if it's fairly, evenly distributed through the community, people are able to access benefits from this increased access to market, maybe at different points throughout the supply chain, you might view it as a good thing. Now, from a socio-ecological perspective, so just highlighting again, thinking about these links and interactions within the system, you might also wonder, what are the ecological outcomes of this change in access to markets? And does that have any implications for future access and future social outcomes? And we know from previous studies that increased access to markets can be a strong driver of ecological decline because it changes the incentive for fishing, which can lead to increased fishing pressure, reduced availability of the resource, which is the very thing that the system we've been looking at is underpinned by. You can't access the resource that's not there. If the fish isn't there, you can't access it. So in that way, it can shape the future access of the resource. So that's essentially why I think this kind of perspective on the theory of access, so taking it further to think about the ecological implications and future implications for access is really important, especially in the sort of undercurrent social and ecological changes that we're seeing globally. So just like again, this has been the focus of access theory. I also want to flag the fisheries ecology literature because that's looked at a different part of this picture. So the focus there has primarily been on specific mechanisms of access, like access to markets or related things such as socioeconomic development, and how that directly impacts ecological outcomes. Two things I want to flag about this literature is that it tends to look at access mechanisms as acting almost in isolation, not really so much about how they interact to shape outcomes, and it tends to use aggregated ecological indicators. So things like total fish biomass, even though we know that different species that have different functional traits, like long-lived versus short-lived species, they don't have the same kind of vulnerability to different changes in access, so we wouldn't expect the outcomes for them to be the same. And then again, focus on the socio-ecological systems literature, really been on these connections and feedbacks within the system. Now, I think that coral reef fisheries offer a particularly interesting context in which to examine these kind of access-driven socio-ecological pathways. They're biodiversity hotspots. They have a huge social role in that they support small-scale fisheries that provide income, food security, cultural identity, and livelihood to millions of people globally. But accessing these systems can be really complex and often very contested. In many coral reef fisheries, there's a huge role for these mechanisms beyond rights that we've talked about. So whether you know someone that has gear, know someone that has a license to go out, if you know someone that has, any kind of regulatory power, knowledge of fishing grounds, and these things can play a really big role in shaping benefits. There's often overlapping formal and informal governance systems that can operate simultaneously across scales. So, for instance, you might have a local customary system that has certain regulations, and then at the regional and national level, they might implement other kinds of regulations that may be contrast with those of the customary management system. So we can end up with these situations of legal pluralism and contested authority. And also just to add to it, the biodiversity and social benefits of coral reef systems are currently under threat, increasing threat, we should say. It's been like that for a while, because of increased competition with these other sectors, some of these that I've listed here. So you can see that in these kind of settings, just thinking about formal and informal rights is probably not going to capture the entire picture. So greater attention to how these mechanisms interact in practice to shape socio-ecological outcomes and feedbacks is really important to help inform better management responses, particularly, as I was saying earlier, in the context of these ongoing social ecological changes. And just a final thing to flag here is that I think it's also really interesting to study reef systems and fisheries specifically in the context of access and socio-ecological systems, because compared to terrestrial systems and things like forestry, they're really understudied. And there's a real need for more marine-specific tools and knowledge and theories to inform decision-making in coastal systems. So what do I want to do? Basically, I would like to try to bridge access theory with ecological system thinking, to sort of look at how I can integrate access theory within the sort of broader socio-ecological systems thinking to improve our understanding of how patterns of access can shape ecological outcomes and then get shaped by them, reshaped by them in the future, with a focus on coral reef small-scale fisheries. To give you an overview of my research design, so I plan to combine different kind of methods ranging from theory to global modeling, more comparative work, and the case study. So starting with the theory, here I basically want to sort of outline or identify typologies of pathways through which these different access mechanisms can lead to different kinds of ecological outcomes, and how those might in turn shape social outcomes like future access. I'm just going to show you a very simplified diagram just to sort of help explain what I mean by this. So, just as an example, you might think about an increased access to capital could lead to an increase to access to these mechanisms we talked about, like technology, labor, storage, these kinds of things, which could increase your capacity to exploit, increase fishing pressure, which in turn will have certain ecological outcomes, which will then feed back to impact access. Or you could hypothesize that increased access to capital would lead to increased access to alternative incomes, which would lower your dependence on fishing and might lead to reduced fishing to pressure, which would have its own ecological impacts and feedbacks. In the sort of global part of my study, I want to look at how specific access-related mechanisms interact to shape ecological outcomes. So here I'm interested in how access to capital, so they're using downscale GDP as a proxy, and access to market using travel time to markets as a proxy, how they interact to shape fish biomass. And here, when I say fish biomass, I want to disaggregate it and look at it for different species groups. So long-lived and slow-growing versus fast-lived and fast-growing species. And then I would like to look at to what extent can governance restrictions on fishing technologies, so thinking about things like fishing gear, but also things like protected areas, temporally protected areas, to what extent can they mitigate those impacts? And for this, I'll be using a data set that I have access to through my research group, which has data across 72 territories globally. And in the comparative fieldwork, this chapter I'll be conducting as part of the wider fieldwork and research that my group does. So we'll be going out to some of these places shown here that are mapped as bright, dark, and average spots. So the bright and dark spots, these are places that have been identified as having fish biomass more than 2 standard deviations above or below expectation. So essentially they're outliers, places that are doing substantially better or substantially worse than you'd expect, given the socioeconomic conditions and environmental conditions they've been exposed to. So they were identified through a positive deviance analysis, also called the bright spots analysis, and it's a sort of a method that's been used in other sectors like health, business, to basically identify these places and try to uncover if there are certain actions, local actions, and governance systems that are in place there that might help explain why they're managing to stay so strong when it seems like everything is going against them. So what I'd be interested in exploring here is looking across the sites that we go to break down what kind of access do people have there for fishing and through which mechanisms. And hopefully I can create a sort of composite score there that you can compare across sites. And basically all of that is to try to get at the question of, are these places ecologically bright because they're socially dark in terms of that access? Is access really restricted in these places? And that's why they're managing to stay ecologically bright? Or what I hope to find is that they're actually ecologically bright because they're socially bright and access is very fair, and people have, you know, alternative income sources perhaps, but yeah, I'll update you on that one. And then in one place I'd like to delve a bit deeper to really understand the underlying system and try to use that if there's interest among stakeholders to see if there's sort of leverage points within the system that could positively influence future socio-ecological trajectories. So one potential exploring here is Aarhus. It's this very small island in Papua New Guinea that Joss has worked in for decades. And there's a very interesting kind of access dynamic happening here, has been happening over decades, that I'd really like to get a better understanding of. So sort of an overview of what we know. There used to be a really strong customary tenure system in place, which included customary closures. The system is still in place and it is still very strong, but it no longer has these customary closures and has in some respect been breaking down. And the result has been reef degradation and declining fish catch near shore. So the reefs are quite degraded and there isn't that much fish near shore, which is where I guess a lot of people used to fish. So now the people that are fishing are generally the people that have access to motorized boats and are able to go further out to sea to catch pelagic fish. So it's kind of an interesting pattern where you used to have a system that was governed really strongly by this customary time system, and it's still governed by a customary system, but it's kind of has an added barrier of this new sort of more expensive technology has become a key access barrier as well. So yeah, I'd really like to unpack this dynamic a bit more. And as I was saying, if there's interest, try to see if there's any kind of leverage points which could help positively influence future both social and ecological outcomes within the system. I just want to come back to this figure I showed at the start, just to show how I think each of these sort of sections I've just talked through fit within this wider framework I showed at the start. So in the theory and case study, I hope to address the entire system, thinking about these feedbacks and all these links and both rights and different access mechanisms. In the global chapter, I'll be zooming in a bit and won't be looking at the feedbacks, but we'll be more looking at how different access mechanisms interact to shape ecological outcomes using disaggregated ecological indicator sim. And then in the comparative fieldwork chapter, I'll be zooming out a bit again and trying to look at the rights as well as access mechanisms, and might try to look at some of those feedbacks as well. So in terms of expected research contributions, from the theory perspective, it will be this framework, bringing access theory and socio-ecological systems thinking together. From an empirical perspective, it will be global evidence and associations between these access mechanisms and ecological outcomes, and sort of the extent to which governance restrictions can help mitigate these impacts, as well as comparative insights of how access patterns vary across ecological contexts. And from a practical perspective, I hope to provide insights that can help managers anticipate how changes in access can reshape socio-ecological outcomes and hopefully inform more proactive management measures. As I say, we are in this world of rapid social and ecological change. So there's something needs to change within the management systems as well. And identify these local leverage points for positive change within the one system. And I plan there that I hope that that can sort of provide a framework that could be applied elsewhere. Just to show you a very simplified sort of view of my preliminary timeline, just to highlight that for the remainder of this year, I plan to focus on the theory, the modeling chapter, as well as getting ethics and research permitting. And then for the next year and a half, really focusing in on the comparative fieldwork and case study fieldwork, and throughout the whole process to do some writing. Thank you very much. Very happy to take any questions or any feedback. Either now or afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefanía. Does anyone have any questions? We can also take questions at the very end. Oh, Bob, I think you had a question, right?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I'm quite interested in how, well, partly with the difference between how you have tenure systems on oceans around islands and stuff. Because traditionally everyone talks about tenure in terms of basically boundaries and who owns what's happening in the boundaries. I think there's quite a lot of question about just how much the tenure actually, whatever the formal tenure is, works. And it's not only from the point of view that you were talking about, it's all these relationships. But it's the idea that people have rights and so forth, and they're straightforward, kind of ignores the fact that often they're completely, as you pointed out, they're informal rights. And it's somehow or other argued by the formal, usually the economists and so on, who say that you've got to have secure rights and so on. And I guess what I'm questioning is the secure rights concept, because there's lots of occasions where people have secure rights and they don't mean anything, because there's all these political, market, greedy people systems that interfere with it. But there's also cases where people don't have secure systems, but they're acknowledged outside, right? So cases in Nepal, for example, which I can document, where people did not have legal rights at the time to the forest areas. In fact, they did things that were completely illegal, but they actually had good relationships with the forest authorities, individuals. So trust was more important than security, or than legal security. So I think that that's another little thing to fit in here. The assumption that sort of formal access is always better than having some kind of just local set of relationships which help you. And I think that's also part of what you're looking at. The political system is not just a political system, as you say, it's power and factors. But often there are things that help you to bypass that. And you can sort of, kind of play around at the edges of a system, and it's not just formal authority, and it's not just how the formal authority works, it's the fact that how it's bypassed.
Yeah.
And in a sense, quite acceptable. So
yeah,
I hope that's clear.
Yeah, no, it was very clear. Thank you. I think I hope that within the border access framework that you're able to sort of capture how these things interact and how there isn't one perfect solution, I guess, and there seems to be quite context dependent.
There was an old theory in anthropological economics, which said that things that just operate as economic systems, the economic systems are embedded in the social system, and the social system is what happens to be there. It's not necessarily something that's kind of a formal structure and so on. I can give you some documents on that, but I'm sure you know it anyhow.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, really exciting study. I think you're responding to what Bob said. I think you're exactly right. That's what theory access is all about, of course. It's not just formal rights. It's broader than that. But also, I didn't quite understand the couple of slides back there. Yeah, the three different, the global patterns, for example.
Global part of it.
Yeah. Do you want to just? I didn't understand downscale GDP. What does that mean? I didn't understand that part.
Okay. I can help try to make that clearer. So this will be using global data set that we have access to through my group, which was actually used to inform where these bright and dark spots are. So it's quite comprehensive. And within that, we do have estimates for the travel time to market for each site. And then downscale GDP is something I'm using from a different paper. So just to capture, obviously it's not at the individual level, because even though it's downscaled, it's still GDP, which will be at a local level, to capture sort of broadly the access to capital that people have. And access to markets is here, as I said, using the proxy of travel time to markets. Obviously, if it was a more local study, there are other things that can play a role in terms of how and whether you're able to access markets, like the mechanisms I listed before. but I'm interested in how they interact to shape fish biomass through fishing pressure. And then we do also have for the sites, so yeah, again, it's like these sites here, we have information on the governance restrictions in place in each site. And so I'll be using that data set to assess to what extent when you have, if you get increase, say if you have run them over this increased access to capital in markets, and then you set certain restrictions, and to what extent can those mitigate those impacts that you see on the biomass? Is that clear?
I think it is. So when you said global patterns, I was thinking that was analytically, you're thinking about global structures, global processes, but it's more your data set.
Yeah.
It's global, yeah.
Good point. I'll use a different word in the future. It could just be global modeling, I guess, maybe. Global study.
Thanks. So that's an excellent presentation. Interested in more methodological question, I guess. From once you've got your bright spots that you've obviously indicated where they are, you had about 10 variables of what could be influencing in the very early on. Is there an assumption that you'll be able to identify a limited number of variables that come out? Because once you get to the case study, it's going to be very specific in particular places. So depending upon where you choose, things like social relations, etc., will be different. So I'm just wondering, from those bright spots, what happens if you end up with a different answer in many different bright spots for the reason? How do you then move to that next phase of choosing a case study that's more detailed within the limits of obviously of a PhD study and the time frame and resources available?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, just to say, like, basically, it's currently work in progress, so I'm currently trying to think through how I'm going to do that. But what I'm thinking about currently is, yeah, you have all this range of mechanisms, but there's one particular study that I know of that did compare across countries in the Mediterranean, compared access, and it created indicators for each of the different mechanisms. And then from that created a composite score that sort of was meant to capture broadly what kind of access people had. And I'm thinking that that is kind of a score that could be compared across places. I also would like to try to see if it may be the case that I'll have to focus on, specific access mechanisms and compare that across the sites. Yeah, it's a little bit to be confirmed, but I'm sort of exploring different methods. But I hope to use like mixed methods and combine some kind of a survey like I talked about, and as well as interviews to try to understand it. And to your point about the case study, that will not really be dependent on this analysis, so that will kind of be separate. It won't be the case that I'll be waiting on the results from the comparative fieldwork, and that will decide where I go for the case study. I'm using like pre-existing literature to decide on that, and where we have like good connections and good understanding of access already that I could build on, which we do have in ours.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
If there are no further questions, please join me in thanking Stefanía.
Hello, everybody. Like Boswale said, I'm Shathuki. I'm also in the Thriving Oceans Research Hub group, and I'm going to be talking about my PhD project, which is looking at understanding the role of supply chains in coral reef fisheries sustainability. And again, I would also like to recognize and pay respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize that we stand here in Valley Ocean. A bit of an overview of my presentation today. I'm going to be giving everybody a bit of a background into my project before introducing the concept of supply chains. And then I will go on to reveal what the big gap that I found is, and then go on to my main study design, and then finish off with my next steps. So fish and fisheries products are amongst the most heavily traded food commodities in the world, and the fisheries sector has been continuously increasing since the mid-1970s, and this reflects the sector's growing degree of integration into the global economy. And when we think about the global fishing sector, you might imagine something that looks like this, big commercial fishing vessel catching all the fish, but actually it can also look like this. Small-scale fisheries are very, very important as well. So a paper that came out in 2025 found that small-scale fisheries actually provide 40%, which equates to 37.5 million tons of fish. So this could even be the fish that ends up in your plate. And this provides over 2.3 billion people on average with 20% of their daily intake of 6 micronutrients, which are really important for human health. So this is really, really important sector as well. And small-scale fishing supports 1 in 12 people worldwide, and this equates to around half of them are women, which generates around 44% of all fisheries value. So this is not just the act of taking the fish out of the ocean, it's also post and pre-harvesting mechanisms like you see in the image here, as well as activities based in trade and markets. Coral reef fisheries within this is a really important subset because they are hotspots for marine biodiversity and they harbor really important commercially important species. Therefore, this supports millions of livelihoods. However, they are threatened by overfishing and climate change. So this kind of presents itself as a really important nexus where we're obviously doing a lot to make sure that these systems are sustainable and these coral reef ecosystems are maximizing their health, but also making sure that these livelihoods are also sustained long term. Coral reef fisheries, again, if we think about it, you might imagine someone catching the fish like this in this image, and then the value of that going and ending up in somebody's plate where they end up eating the fish. But actually, it gets a lot more complicated than that, and there are a lot of actors involved in the fish being caught and then it ending up in people's plates. For the purpose of this presentation of my project, I'm going to be defining supply chains as a set of relationships which govern the flow of goods. And remember, with these goods also comes information and capital, not just the flow of goods. And this includes suppliers, distributors, and retailers. And it enables the transformation and value addition of the raw material into its final product during consumption. But actually, supply chains are a lot more, go beyond that. They constitute intricate social and institutional arrangements with actors and organizations that structure how value, power, and governance circulate within these networks. If we pay attention to the image here on the left, I captured this in a fisheries harbor in the western coast of Sri Lanka, and it looks like the start of what constitutes the start of a supply chain. The fish are getting put into this blue tray here to be then traded on later on. But actually, it goes beyond this. So we see that there are some middlemen or middle people here that are there to buy the fish and sell it on. But actually, who's allowed to be in this space? Who has a capital to buy such an amount of fish and then make profit off of it while selling on to smaller traders? Who's actually bringing the fish into this space? Is it the fisher themselves? Or is it another actor who's also gaining value from being part of this within the supply chain? So supply chains, really important, as I figured it out, but in wildlife conservation specifically, it helps you determine which type of, where the demand is coming from, where the market dynamics and how they operate, which helps you implement policy and interventions. But also they really have been important in other sorts of fields as well, which is where my literature review came in. I was really interested to see how other disciplines use different supply chain frameworks to study these dynamics. And I've categorized these into 3 main areas: supply chain management, global commodity chain, global value chain perspectives, and finally, global production networks. Supply chain management comes from business school disciplines, and they look at really about efficiency. So how is the system can be made more efficient to maximize profit? This could be through removing an unnecessary actor, for example, again, with the idea of maximizing profit. And a lot of this literature also looks at, for example, customer satisfaction to, again, thinking about how much money we get. The other perspectives are looking at global commodity chain and global value chain. So these frameworks actually come from global systems theory. And they think about how value is actually, so it's a linear chain, but value addition through each step actually changes. And value creation is uneven. It's actually influenced by governance and power by lead firms. It also looks at whether the supply chain is producer or buyer-driven as well. And finally, for global production networks, it really thinks about the supply chain not just as a linear chain, but as a complex network. And it thinks about how power is relational and transaction specific, emerging through interdependencies between actors, firms, NGOs, states, and unions. So the supply chain is not really isolated, it sits within this broader context of rich institutions that really determine how power is distributed. So there are these three important kind of categories of supply chains that I've put together through my literature review, and they provide a contemporary lens for analyzing how supply chains are structured, governed, and embedded within these wider socio-economic and political contexts. And they provide really key insights in how we can understand trade and market dynamics. But we've kind of established that coral reefs are really critical sector as well. And when we're trying to apply these frameworks to something like coral reefs, which are kind of tend to be smaller scale, it tends to not meet some of the assumptions that are made by these big global frameworks. And there is another really apparent gap, and this is the lack of consideration of ecology. So ecological dynamics so far tend to remain in the periphery of these frameworks, but considering these dynamics are really important for resource-based industries because they directly influence supply chain dynamics like demand, prices, harvesting practices, trade, and distribution, especially for especially for a sector like probably fisheries, which is directly dependent on things like ecosystem health, resource availability, and habitat conditions. So this is kind of the thinking that has led me to my PhD overarching research aim, which is to explore how different configurations of coral reef fishery supply chains interact with ecological systems in shaping sustainability outcomes. My study design is kind of divided into three main categories. The first is a theoretical chapter to continue my exploration into these different frameworks, to think about how they can better integrate ecological dynamics into these frameworks themselves. And actually, this ecological gap has already been kind of acknowledged, and there are already studies that are trying to address this gap. So I'm also interested to kind of review this literature to see how they can be used to look at coral reef fishery supply chains. And I'm hoping to do this with critical reading and synthesis. Next, I'm also hoping to use the ecological data set that Thriving Oceans Research Hub has access to really model these landscapes of demand against sustainability outcomes. And I'll go into this a little bit further in my presentation, but I'm hoping to use spatial network construction with these sustainability calculations. Finally, is when I'm hoping to actually go into the field and map out these supply chain configurations with ecological traits. And I'm hoping to use landing site surveys to look at what species are being landed and how they're distributed within the chain, and also speak to stakeholders as well. And finally, I'm really interested to understand how social networks, especially in these small-scale fisheries contexts, where a lot of interactions and how a product gets moved within this chain depends on informal and trust-based relationships. So I'm also hoping to look at that using social network analysis and qualitative insights. So my PhD project, again, sits within this kind of three main stages, but for the rest of this talk, I'll be talking about my modeling chapter and a bit more about my empirical work. So the global ecological data set that we have has more than 70 territories, and we can kind of figure out whether each of these ecological sites are being fished at a sustainable or an unsustainable level. And what I'm hoping to do is use that to map it against modeling global demand. So what do I mean by this, and how does it relate to supply chains? Well, we know that population sectors act as demand hubs in supply chains. So it's essentially the final destination of these supply chains. And that's where all the consumers are and where the coral reef fisheries products are getting consumed. So more people means that there's more purchasing power and more consumers. But how do these products actually get to these population centers? Well, it's through roads. Roads are really important infrastructure for these distribution of goods. And essentially we can figure out, how the distribution mechanisms of the supply chain using these roads. And we know that taken together, strong demand and easy access means that it influences coral reef condition, and this has already been proved in the literature. But what I'm hoping to do with this chapter is move beyond that to look at the actual structure of the transport network to identify these patterns in distribution. I'm hoping to use data that's already available using population density data and road networks using OpenStreetMap to map this demand, and mapping the roads as a network. So I hope I haven't lost many of you there. I do have an interesting schematic diagram to show what I actually mean. So let's say we have a coral reef cluster here. And again, with our ecological data, we can figure out whether this reef is being sustainably fished or not. And then we can figure out where the different settlements are. So there's a city here, there's a town here, and there's a village here. And we can see how they're connected to each other. So in this case, both the town and the village are connected to the city. And categorizing these different settlements into different nodes, we can then create what's known as a network motif, which is a certain structure in the network. Let's take another example. There's a village here, a city here, and a city here. This time, they're all connected using roads. And again, this is a network motif as well. Ultimately, what I'm hoping to figure out in this chapter is to match certain network motifs to sustainably fished reefs versus non-sustainably fished reefs. We are also hoping to do some matching, comparing the reef sites that share similar characteristics, for example, history of disturbance. And we're moving beyond just looking at travel time and distance to markets, but actually thinking about that, how that access is structured and how it operates. Okay, moving on to my empirical work. I'm hoping to, again, use a mixed method approach to combine quantitative mapping of the supply chain structures with qualitative insights from around 3 sites. Again, this is a work in progress, but I'm hoping to actually go in and map out the configurations of the coral reef supply chains with the ecological kind of aspects as well. A little bit more into detail about what I mean by this when I talk about configurations, looking at the actual landscape themselves. So not just how many actors, but the categories of different actors and how they participate in each site's supply chain and how they differ across the different sites as well. I'm also going to be looking at product diversity, so thinking about the range of reef products and how they flow within each of the supply chains, and also ecology. So how is site-specific ecological factors influencing how it's being harvested and by whom? So for example, one idea right now I have is to look at functional groups, so which are species that are particularly important for the functioning of that ecosystem and for its health, and whether certain demand and supply chain dynamics are targeting those species which are really important, and how they're distributed. And finally, relational dynamics. So like I said, in these community-based kind of supply chains, informal and trust-based relationships are really important in who you sell your fish to. It could be your relation, it could be your friend. So what does this mean for the distribution of the power and the value of that product? And what sustainability implications does this have? In terms of the proposed outcomes, I'm hoping to better understand on how to integrate ecology into evolving frameworks of supply chains, and to specifically add this to small-scale resource-based industry, as we know, for critical contexts such as coral reef fisheries. With my modeling chapter, I'm hoping to understand global trends in demand through road connectivity and its association with sustainable and unsustainable coral reef sites. And finally, to test out theory with empirical research on the ground. In terms of my next steps, I'm hoping to continue advancing my research and my reading on supply chain frameworks and increasingly creating this comprehensive literature review. And yeah, the modeling stages for my chapter 2 are also in its early stages, so continue doing this. And finally, to refine my research questions, to submit all my ethics documentation. And I have my full detailed Gantt chart here, but I'm going to focus your attention on what's going to happen in basically in July after I officially a second year PhD student. I'm hoping to again continue working on my chapter 1 and 2, but put in my ethics application to hopefully start fieldwork in the second half of the year. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Shathuki. Does anyone have any questions for Shathuki?
Thanks. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. Is the model? I think you're calling the modeling chapter or the modeling study. There's a really strong emphasis on roads there.
Mm-hmm.
Are you sure that's justified? In the sense of we know that global supply chains are global.
Yeah.
And so then their network, not just with the way that diagram appeared, you're looking at local road networks, which is the first stage of a value chain or a supply chain. And it doesn't really take into account the full network.
Yeah.
So global demand, blue swimmer crabs, it is in America. And that is then being filtered down and affecting resource management in coastal Indonesia, for example. And then it's got nothing really to do with the road networks except for maybe the first stage of supply chain. But even then, it could be through boats or to other hubs. So I wasn't quite sure how you're integrating the framework which presented the supply chain network, supply chain types you had there, which are often focused on global dynamics. But then that was sort of really absent from the analytical framework you're using. Can you tell?
Yeah, no, that's a very good observation. Actually, when we're thinking about coral reef fisheries themselves, they tend to be more of the small scale, so regionally or like consumed in the very like local level, which is again why I was kind of talking about the point of that coral reef fisheries don't tend to meet the assumptions made by those bigger frameworks, which are thinking about those global supply chains. And it could be possible that when we actually go on the ground that actually they are connected or connected to a more global chain. For example, we see that in the live reef trade, for example, but for what we're looking at just for like fish products, the assumption right now that we know is that it remains regionally or it remains in the local level. But again, I think with them understanding more of with a lot of like the GPN like frameworks and thinking about the more like contextual aspect of my case study, I think that I'm hoping to get more from the qualitative work that I do on the ground rather than just the modeling chapter, because this is really thinking about more of the local or regional consumption of and how that works into the distribution of the supply chain.
I thought you started off though with the fact about international trade in fisheries.
It's true. I guess that was like the hook to like really talk about. I mean, supply like small scale fisheries are important, but and the fact that the figure that I was sharing with you, like the 40% market, that is important, but for more local consumption of the fish, rather than being plugged into the global. So I guess that's something that we also try to think about with this modeling chapter, because we're thinking about it from a like global perspective, but a lot of these contexts, they remain in the regional local scale for consumption. Yeah. Does that make sense?
I'm struggling a bit because I thought you also emphasized that even though it's small scale fisheries, often it is actually linked into global markets. Isn't that what you presented at the outset?
Yeah, that was I guess I was trying to kind of talk about how they are important, but it's more, again, like for the local consumption than for it getting plugged on. So what we're seeing in, like for tuna, for example, that's like a global, that's very global, right? Like that would be like tuna or things like that. But actually when we're thinking about more small scale fisheries, they're like multi-species and they are like, opportunistic fishing that ends up more regionally, that gets sold to markets and then things like that. It could be that they end up in a bigger, like a city, for example, in a market in a city, but beyond that, they don't tend to go beyond, like to be linked to the global market. But I think I was just trying to talk about how we tend to look at supply chains in a like tuna, how it's important in the global context, but actually small scale fishing tends to really not be taken as very seriously because again, it's like people eating fish in the coastal town, right? But it provides really important like micronutrients for those people because that's where the protein comes from. And that's, I guess, what we're trying to think about. But the chapter 2 with the modeling work, we're trying to take it into a higher scale, but again, still thinking about the regional level. Yeah. Talk about it even later on.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're doing research on small scale fisheries and how it's linked into global markets.
Yeah.
And obviously, there are many small scale fisheries that are actually linked globally. And I thought the frameworks you're using are really well tailored to understanding those global dynamics, which could be kind of interesting to explore what effects different governance structures through the value chain or supply chain might be having on ecological outcomes as well. That would be part of the framework, maybe.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any other comments or questions for Shathuki? Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Billy.
Thank you. I have two, but maybe I'll start with one. Can you maybe just say a bit more about what understanding those network motifs will allow you to do or suggest? So if we know X, then what would change in perhaps or suggest change? We can start about PhD.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess it kind of allows you to, so we know, like I said, that the distance to market, like that makes sense, right? If the coral reef is closer to a market, that means that it's more exploitable, I guess, in a way. But we're trying to think about, how different settlements are linked to each other as well. So thinking about the structure of it. So if there's a road between, I don't know, two of the settlements, is that almost like, that doesn't really make an impact as much because they're already connected in another network motif. So thinking if we can predict how exploitable or like how accessible a market is depend on the structure, it kind of thinks about more of the structural aspect of rather than just like distance to market or which is what's been done so far. It kind of like adds that additional layer, I would say. Thinking about more of that. And then I think that could have very important like issues for the intervention. So thinking about, and in another perspective, it's also hard to be like, okay, we shouldn't be connecting roads. We shouldn't be using roads to like connect because obviously roads are important for other infrastructure, but I think it makes you think about it in terms of like the overall conservation perspective and I hope that makes sense. But it just kind of moves beyond that to think about the structural level, that just using distance to market, which is what's been done so far in the field.
Maybe my second one quickly. Thank you.
Yes.
Just when you said you're going to talk to stakeholders as part of the third part. Who are the stakeholders and what are you talking about?
So with mapping supply chain configurations, it's a lot to actually go it takes a lot of work. So I've done it previously to map the supply chain of shark and ray fisheries, which again is really particular in a small kind of like market. And that took a lot of work, but actually speaking to stakeholders who are, I guess, higher up. So this could be someone in a fisher cooperative in that area who knows where the fish is going, who the biggest traders are. So it could be, for example, a trader could be connected to multiple different fishers and they have a really good knowledge about what the structure of the supply chain is. So that would be the stakeholders that I actually go talk to. And hopefully, again, we have networks of people that we're already going to like in these places. So we can identify who those stakeholders are and then go and speak to them. They'll just give us an easy access to that information about like creating that first structure of the supply chain, then actually going and doing snowball sampling and mapping it one by one. It could be like traders, it could be high-ups in fishing cooperatives and things like that. And that was for that really first part to like create the configurations themselves. Thank you.
Are there any further questions? If not, please join me in thanking Shathuki.